Hi, I'm David DeSteno, and I'm here today with Sigal Samuel, who's a staff writer at Vox.com and also co-host of the Future Perfect podcast. She writes quite often about religion and science topics for Vox.com, and before that, she was the religion editor at The Atlantic. So Sigal, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's fun to talk about this with you.
Thanks. So, I think it's fair to say that if you look at the data over the past few decades, coming from a lot of places, but a lot of it coming from the Pew Research Center, religion has been kind of declining. And by that, I mean the percentage of people who identify as religious has been going down. But at the same time, there seems to be an uptick in people identifying as spiritual or as interested in other forms of spirituality. And so it's as if people are trying to find other ways to fill in that gap, what religion used to provide them by using different sets of tools. And so as someone who thinks a lot about this, I'm wondering, what's your sense of the trends in religion and spirituality, and what role do you think either of those fulfills in people that there's this desire to keep looking for it?
I think that religion has historically filled some needs that are basic human psychological drives that are never going to go away. Desire for meaning, desire to understand who we are and what we're doing on this earth. Are we alone in the universe? How are we to deal with suffering? When someone we love dies, how are we meant to deal with our grief? How can we celebrate joyful moments and establish strong ties of social connection? All of these are really fundamental human drives, and although the propensity to stick to more hierarchical organized religion has gone down, we're still seeing people looking really, really hungrily for spiritual experiences because those fundamental drives haven't gone away. So I think that we're seeing a lot of alienation, especially in my generation, the millennial generation, from these very hierarchical, traditional forms of religion. In some cases, I think that's caused by or spurred on by perceived, problems with hierarchy. Definitely a prime example would be the sexual abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, just to give one example. But also, I think that we're generally moving in a direction as a society where we don't source the authenticity of an experience from its ancientness so much as from the subjective feeling it gives to me, the practitioner. So I think for a lot of young people, it's less important that, oh, my great-great-grandmother did this thing the exact way that I'm doing it. And it's more important that something produces in me a subjective felt experience of meaning now. And that's what makes someone my age typically perceive it as authentic, an authentic spiritual experience. So I think there's these sorts of historical shifts that are due to what's actually been happening in institutionalized religion and some of the very real problems we see there, but also just this more cultural shift that is kind of working in tandem with that to move people away from the institutional religion and toward the more a la carte religion, you could say.
So in some ways, the tendency towards spirituality that you're talking about, can you think about that as a desire or hunger for use of those tools?
Yeah, definitely. I think that what's happened is with the advent of the Enlightenment and all the amazing science we have going on these days in labs, people have felt that that's chipping away at the sort of theological, metaphysical claims made by a lot of religions. And there's been this assumption that if you're going to lose the metaphysics of the religion, you also have to jettison the rituals and practices of that religion. But I think that's there's a baby here desperately in need of some bathwater. I don't think that necessarily has to be the case, right? I think you can sometimes preserve the rituals and the practices, which I agree with you, they are essentially these technologies that have been fine-tuned, time-tested, debugged over the centuries to produce in human beings certain emotional, psychological states that are positive on the whole.
You have training and think a lot in terms of science and neuroscience as well as religion. And so from someone who straddles that intellectual divide, I'm wondering what you think about where we are right now and the tension between those two. And, you can look at, on one side, you have fundamentalists in religious faiths who are rejecting all science, but on the other side, you have folks like the new atheists who are kind of saying everything about religion is problematic. And sure, religion is a tool. It can be used for good or bad. But how much do you think that's getting us in the way of having these types of conversations, or getting in the way of people looking to kind of these tools to better their life?
I think it's really such a shame. I think it is a waste, both when religious fundamentalists choose to ignore science and all the good that that can bring into our lives, but equally when people in the scientific world just are quite blind to all the benefits we can gain from taking seriously what religion and religious history has to offer. There's a lot of reinventing the wheel that is happening.
Yeah.
Let's, to concretize this a bit, let's take the experience of Shabbat, or the Sabbath. I grew up in the Orthodox Jewish community, grew up observing the Sabbath quite strictly. And I couldn't help but kind of chuckle to myself when a few years ago I saw this trend arising in secular America to have 24-hour digital detox or day of unplugging. People are saying, like, let's just take Tuesday and make it a national day of unplugging. And I say to myself, oh, you mean Shabbat? Right? Like, it's people have been doing this for thousands of years. Or another example would be Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey tweeted a couple of years ago, he was getting into intermittent fasting. And, he tweeted, like, I'm having this realization that fasting changes my perception of time. Time kind of slows down. I can be more reflective. Has anyone else had this experience? And, just millions of Muslims kind of rolled their eyes at this, because of course, fasting is a very common part of religious experience. So I think we need a real deep humility in the scientific community to, have scientists who are willing to look at religion and say, okay, if human beings have been engaging in these types of practices for millennia, probably there's something valuable in there. Probably there's some useful insights we can glean about human nature and what works to modulate that nature.
I know one of the other things that you've been interested in and written a lot about is the idea of mysticism. Pursuing that transcendent experience. For a lot of people, not a lot, but each religion has a mystical aspect to it for some of its adherents. And that is not thinking about and praying to God in the original way, but kind of experiencing. But what I'm wondering is what you think about the quick versus the long way to get there, and what that tells us about whether or not, when we talk about removing these things from their ancient context or wisdom, is there a danger in that? Is there a danger in doing ayahuasca if I'm not doing all the singing the Icaros and the chants and everything that surrounds it?
Okay, this is a great question. I'm so glad you asked it. A few things spring to mind. One is, and Richie Davidson and David Goldman explore this in their book on the neuroscience of meditation, which is a great book. They talk about how, yes, it's possible, whether through meditation or through psychedelic drugs or whatever it is, to kind of get a quick hit of a spiritual experience, right? This sort of quick path, and you, after a very short intervention, you are suddenly experiencing this magnificent spiritual experience. But does it last? If you want it to be an enduring change, like you become a more compassionate person, not just for a day, but for years, you might need to put in more work. And then the other part of this is less the pragmatic side of the question and more the ethical side of the question, which is, is there something ethically dubious about disentangling a ritual from its historical lineage, right? And it's sort of larger cultural context. I think you often see this critique when it comes to this sort of McMindfulness that we see in America, right? Where companies are having their employees learn mindfulness meditation, but the goal is to boost productivity in the workplace, right? So what are we losing when we frame it that way? Well, in the original Eastern traditions that we're pulling this meditation from, meditation wasn't just about me coming to feel less anxious and stressed for a day so I can be more productive at work. It's really about my moral obligations to other people in society, training my attention so I can be more present and compassionate to other people and fulfill my ethical duties towards them. So when we take it out of that context, we risk losing that. And that's precious. I don't think we want to lose that.
Let me move us in a slightly different direction. I know you also read about technology a bit. And so there's a move these days to think about how is religion going to mix with advances that are coming in AI. There is, even folks out there arguing for a church of AI. I can't remember his name.
Anthony Lewandowski.
Anthony Lewandowski, exactly, right. The way forward. And the idea is let's rely on AI to crowdsource what is the best rules of the way to live in, what is ethical, or let's use not his church, but the robotic priest, et cetera. And so as someone who sits in this intersection of topics, what are your thoughts about what's going to happen and the way forward here? I
think that AI will and is already, we're already seeing it infiltrate religion. And of course, why wouldn't it? It's going to infiltrate every domain of life, and religion is no different. And so you already have robot priests, which are robots that function as priests, which I had a lot of fun writing an article about that for Vox a few months ago. You're going to have AI stepping into these roles of kind of ethically or spiritually advising us, which I think there are potentially some benefits to that if you're in a community where you can't afford to have a human religious advisor, and you have a lot of lonely older adults, let's say, and you want someone to recite the Bible to them or something like that. Potentially you have some good use cases there, but a lot of risks too, because people tend to have this misperception of AI as being somehow objective, but it is never objective. There's always biases encoded into it by the humans who've made these AIs. And so there's always a danger that the AI is going to be giving you some spiritual advice that is going to lead you not in a great direction. Of course, you could say a human priest might also give you bad advice, and that's true. But at least when you go to the human priest for advice, that's a human being and they're fallible, and you're aware of the biases they might have, whereas you might fall prey to the misconception that the AI is objective. Before we go, I want to ask you one more thing. I know as part of hosting the Future Perfect podcast, you've been focusing on a segment now called The Way Through, which is focusing on, the idea of plagues and social unrest and difficult times is unfortunately not new to humans, right? We've been through this before. And if we didn't have the capacity to be resilient, we wouldn't be here now, we would have died out. And so it's looking to ideas from the past to find what advice we can take from that to help people be more resilient in these times of social isolation or grief and loss that's going on as a result of COVID. And so from talking to a lot of people, both people going through difficult times and spiritual thinkers, what advice would you like to share with us? What tools can we take? It was really interesting because we talked to secular philosophers. I interviewed someone like Cornel West, but also, who has a deep Christian background, but also Buddhists, Islamic scholars, rabbis, you name it. One that's springing to mind for me right now is Omid Safi. He is a scholar of Islamic mysticism at Duke University. And specifically, he specializes in the poetry of Rumi, this Persian mystic and poet who is very beloved in the West as well. And I talked to Omid about suffering and solitude in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. I think that a lot of advice we've been seeing, including from religious leaders, has been, how to get away from suffering, how to turn towards happiness, how to not suffer, how to get away from solitude. But there's this really interesting tradition, a strain in Islamic thought about how suffering and solitude can actually be ennobling and productive under the right circumstances. So, and Rumi, for example, constantly throughout his poetry, you'll see him say things like, seek pain, pain, pain.
Mm-hmm.
Brother, where is your pain, right? He's encouraging us to seek out more suffering. But there has to be a wisdom with which you do that. You don't want to just throw yourself into a situation where you purposely get COVID, for example. That would not be a productive suffering. So I asked Omid, how do we make our suffering or solitude useful and ennobling in this pandemic? He said, there's really the emphasis in a lot of Islamic mysticism is on breaking down our concept of our self as this bounded, separate ego that is separable from everyone else. There is this concept of al-fana, which is when your particular ego self is absorbed into the bigger sea of being. And the idea is that suffering can be ennobling when we use it to remind ourselves that actually we are suffering just like everyone else suffers. So when we can use our suffering as a bridge to link us to others and to remind ourselves that just as I'm suffering through this horrible pandemic and it's lonely and it's boring and it's scary and all of those things, 7 billion other people are experiencing that as well. And when you can use it to feel connected to other beings, that actually can transform the suffering into something almost joyous, because that sense of what psychologists today call small self, where you're shifting your focus from just being inward, you're shifting out to connect to others, is, we now know, hugely beneficial for our mental health and well-being. So that was kind of an interesting takeaway that I am trying very consciously to apply in my day-to-day pandemic life. I'm trying to do anything I can to shift my focus out, because I find that the more I do that, it is actually helping me suffer less or suffer better during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it just astounds me, right? The insight there. So one of my colleagues, Daniel Lim, works on how facing adversity in life affects people. Does it harden your heart or does it warm it? And there's heterogeneity, but on average, for most people who come through it, it actually makes them more empathetic. It makes them more compassionate. It makes them want to reach out and connect to others. And one reason we think that is because in so doing, you build those bonds, you build those connections that bring you joy. Trying to help other people, we know, actually is interpreted in the brain as pleasurable, and it actually is encoded in the brain as reward. And so it's taking the joy in that, not that in your suffering, but in knowing your suffering, you feel that connection, you want to help other people. Even connection itself just boosts the compassion we feel. And so reframing those experiences can be a really powerful idea. And yes, we're discovering that now, and yes, we're publishing data on that, but it sounds like that's not news to many religious thinkers.
Yeah, I mean, none of what we've discussed here is news to religious thinkers, whether it's the fact that giving charity and directing your attention to help others actually boosts your own well-being, or whether it's that the idea we talked about a moment ago about how it's not great to just get those quick hit spiritual experiences, those sort of shiny mystical experiences that don't last and may even distract you from a loftier spiritual goal. Islamic mystics were already pointing that out in the Middle Ages. So there's so many rich insights about human nature in these religious traditions that I would love to see more scientists mining and respectfully kind of using and incorporating in contemporary scientific research as you're doing.
Well, thank you for your thoughts, and hopefully that will help foster this conversation. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.